Picture this. It is, well, it's the 1980s.
Right. A fascinating era for corporate
Oh,
strategy.
totally. And Monsanto is just this absolute titan of industry. I mean, a sprawling powerhouse.
Quite. They were an utterly dominant force at the time.
Exactly. And during a routine strategic review, their management makes what seems like, a perfectly rational, spreadsheet-driven decision.
The kind of decision MBA programs used to applaud, actually.
Right. They decide to exit a very specific, seemingly niche sector of their business, specifically the manufacturing of float zone silicon for the emerging semiconductor industry.
Because the margins perhaps weren't quite there yet.
Yeah, exactly. The quarterly projections probably didn't look stellar, so they just pack it up. It's perfect business sense in the moment.
On paper, yes, it looks like efficient capital allocation.
But what they completely fail to realize is that this single, seemingly minor operational pivot will fundamentally, permanently lock them out of the future.
It is a phenomenal historical example, and it strikes at the very heart of what we are examining today.
It really does. So, welcome to this session of the Pocket MBA.
Indeed. Today, we are attempting to solve one of the most persistent, frankly frustrating mysteries in corporate strategy.
Because we all know the prevailing assumption, right? If an organization desires innovation, it simply needs to apply capital.
Precisely. You allocate a massive budget to your research and development department, you hire the brightest minds available, you command them to innovate, and market dominance naturally follows.
Like it's a straightforward equation. You put money in, you get innovation out.
It is treated almost like corporate physics.
Yeah, exactly. Corporate physics. But when you step out of the textbook and into the actual chaotic world of market disruption, that neat little equation just shatters.
Yeah, absolutely falls apart.
Because we consistently see organizations with colossal budgets and, incredible talent pools completely stagnate.
They entirely miss the boat on massive technological shifts.
Right, while some scrappy competitor with a fraction of the resources effortlessly adapts and just takes over the market. So what is the missing variable here?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Why do some companies effortlessly digest new knowledge and evolve, while others, despite having billions in the bank, essentially starve to death in a supermarket?
Well, that missing variable is what management scholars refer to as absorptive capacity.
Okay. Absorptive capacity.
Yes. And our mission for today's exploration is to completely deconstruct this concept for you.
Because it's not just a buzzword, it's an entire operational framework.
Quite so. To do this, we are examining a stack of sources that spans 20 years of foundational academic management research.
A lot of ground to cover.
It is. We will begin with the breakthrough 1990 research by Wesley Cohen and Daniel Leventhal.
The pioneers, basically.
Indeed. And then we'll navigate through a series of landmark empirical studies from the late 90s and early 2000s before concluding with the highly integrative frameworks developed around 2010.
By researchers like Volberta, right?
Precisely. Our objective today is to understand the actual hidden mechanics of how an organization acquires, digests, and ultimately profits from new knowledge.
And before we really get into the weeds here, just a quick note to you, the listener.
A very necessary caveat, I think.
Yeah, because we are covering a massive amount of ground today, touching on various corporate behaviors, management strategies, and honestly, a lot of internal political dynamics.
The messy human element.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want to be clear that we are acting strictly as your neutral guides to this academic research.
We are just looking at the data.
Right. Our goal is to unpack the mechanics of organizational learning exactly as the research presents it. We aren't here to take sides.
And we certainly aren't endorsing any specific corporate policies or political ideologies within the workplace.
No, not at all. We're just looking at the how and the why of the data so you can apply it to your own teams.
Precisely. We're here to examine the machinery of learning, not to pass judgment on the operators.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
So, to lay our foundation, we have to transport ourselves back to 1990.
The business landscape back then was heavily focused on lean efficiency.
Right, and R&D was largely viewed through a very, very narrow lens.
It was. Enter Wesley Cohen and Daniel Leventhal, who published research that fundamentally shifted how business schools conceptualize corporate learning.
This was the big paradigm shift.
It was. They introduced the term absorptive capacity, frequently abbreviated as ACAP in the literature.
ACAP. Got it. So how exactly did they define it?
They formally defined it as a firm's ability to recognize the value of new external information, assimilate it, and apply it to commercial ends.
Okay, let's unpack this definition because on the surface, It just sounds like standard corporate jargon.
It does sound rather dry initially.
But it is actually a massive shift in thinking. Because before this, the vast majority of executives viewed research and development purely as an invention machine.
A complete black box.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A black box. You feed money into the box, the scientists do their mysterious work, and out pops a shiny new patent or a proprietary product that you can sell.
But Cohen and Leventhal proved that R&D actually serves a vital secondary function that most managers were completely ignoring.
And what's that?
It builds the firm's capacity to understand what everyone else is doing.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about inventing your own stuff.
Not at all. And what makes this insight so critical is that, mathematically speaking, this secondary function is arguably far more vital for a company's long-term survival than the primary one.
Wait, really? The secondary function is more important?
Absolutely. If you examine the trajectory of any major industry, the vast majority of technological change is not generated by a single isolated firm having a eureka moment.
Right. It's not just one genius in a garage.
Exactly. It is incremental. It builds upon a massive, shared, global body of scientific work.
Okay, so if you're entirely focused inward,
If an organization's R&D department is entirely inward-looking, if they are only focused on inventing their own proprietary widget, they are catastrophically neglecting the foundation required to evaluate the external environment.
because they can't even read the signals.
Precisely. They are actively failing to build their absorptive capacity.
It's exactly like learning a foreign language. Think about it.
A very apt comparison. Go on.
You cannot possibly appreciate a brilliant, complex piece of French poetry if you haven't first invested the grueling, unglamorous time in learning basic French vocabulary.
The syntax, the grammar.
Yes, you could be staring right at a literary masterpiece, and to you, it would just look like random ink on a page.
Because you lack the cognitive capacity to decode it.
Exactly. In a corporate setting, your R&D department is what builds your vocabulary. If you aren't doing the basic foundational research, even if it doesn't immediately lead to a product, you won't even possess the framework to recognize when a competitor has published a breakthrough.
A breakthrough that might be about to destroy your entire business model.
Right, you'll just look at their patent and shrug, because you literally don't speak the language.
That is a highly illustrative way to frame it. And if we carry that logic forward, it explains a structural phenomenon that Cohen and Leventhal termed path dependence.
Path dependence, meaning where you've been dictates where you can go.
Precisely. In the realm of organizational learning, knowledge is strictly cumulative. You cannot simply leapfrog the basics when it suddenly becomes convenient.
So you can't just cram for the test at the last minute.
Exactly. Accumulating absorptive capacity in one period permits an organization to accumulate it more efficiently in the next period. It compounds, much like financial interest.
Okay, that makes sense. The more you know, the easier it is to learn the next thing.
Indeed. However, the inverse is also true, and it is deeply perilous.
Uh-oh.
If a firm ceases investing in its absorptive capacity in a rapidly moving technological field, it inevitably suffers from what the researchers call lockout.
Lockout. That is a
Ah.
terrifying concept for any executive to hear. It implies a door slamming shut that you just, you can't reopen.
It does. Which brings us right back to our opening story about Monsanto.
Oh, right. So what exactly happened to them?
Well, when Monsanto made the financial decision to exit the float zone silicone manufacturing business, it was observed by analysts that this was not merely a temporary pause to reallocate capital.
It wasn't just taken to breather.
No, it was an irreversible lockout. You see, each subsequent generation of technology in the semiconductor space built heavily upon the manufacturing tacit knowledge of the prior generation.
The hands-on experience.
Exactly. By completely halting their internal R&D and manufacturing in that specific area, Monsanto actively eroded their own cognitive vocabulary.
So they basically forgot how to speak silicon.
Precisely. They lost the ability to even comprehend the subsequent advances in the field.
Because they weren't doing the daily work anymore. They weren't in the labs dealing with the microscopic manufacturing errors, so they didn't understand the solutions that other companies were coming up with.
Exactly. And the crucial takeaway for you as a business manager listening is that they couldn't simply decide to buy their way back into the market 5 years later when it became highly profitable again.
Wait, they couldn't just throw money at it?
They could not. They no longer possess the internal expertise required to evaluate, integrate, or utilize the new external knowledge.
Wow.
The cost of getting back on the technological escalator once you have stepped off becomes exponentially, prohibitively high. You quite literally do not know what you do not know.
You have to be actively playing the game just to understand the rules of the next level.
That is exactly it.
So building this foundational knowledge, this vocabulary, is the absolute first step to staying competitive against your external rivals.
Without a doubt.
But, this raises a fascinating internal dilemma. We've established that a company needs baseline vocabulary to survive the outside world.
Yes.
But what happens when the knowledge is already inside the building? Like, the company has spent the R&D money, they have the brilliant engineers, the breakthrough has happened, yet one department completely fails or refuses to share that knowledge with another department.
Yes, the classic internal bottleneck. Which brings us to a massive misconception about corporate behavior and our next foundational piece of research.
I love this part.
We are shifting now to a landmark 1996 study conducted by Gabriel Zulansky. He set out to rigorously investigate a phenomenon he termed internal stickiness.
Internal stickiness.
Yes, which describes the rather profound difficulty large organizations face when attempting to transfer their own best practices from one internal division to another.
And I love diving into this specific study because it completely eviscerates conventional managerial wisdom.
It truly does.
If you walk into any Fortune 500 company and ask a manager why the team in Chicago refuses to adopt a proven, highly successful practice from the team in Tokyo, they will almost universally point to motivation.
They will blame internal politics.
Right. They will cite the infamous not invented here syndrome.
The NIH syndrome, yeah.
Exactly. They will confidently tell you, oh, the Chicago team's ego is just bruised. Or it's a classic corporate turf war.
Or perhaps we just haven't incentivized them properly with their end-of-year bonuses.
Yes. We have this deeply ingrained assumption that people are just being stubborn, jealous, or inherently political.
But Zulansky did not rely on assumptions. He looked at the actual operational data.
His data set was massive, wasn't it?
It was, and I want to take a moment to emphasize the rigor of his methodology here, because it is what makes the findings so irrefutable.
Right. He didn't just ask people how they felt.
Exactly. He didn't just distribute a survey. He tracked 122 specific best practice transfers across 8 major multinational companies.
122.
Yes. We are talking about tracking the transfer of concrete processes, like a new software protocol or a specific supply chain efficiency trick, from the very moment the transfer was initiated.
All the way to the end.
All the way to the point where the receiving department either successfully routinized the new practice or the transfer completely failed.
So he essentially put a GPS tracker on the knowledge and just watched where it got stuck.
A perfect analogy. And to analyze this massive data set, he utilized something called canonical correlation analysis.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that one to me.
Of course. It is a highly advanced statistical method that allows researchers to evaluate the complex relationships between 2 sets of multiple variables simultaneously.
So it filters out the noise.
Precisely. It isolates the actual drivers of behavior. And the findings generated by this analysis were absolutely startling to the management community.
What do they find?
The data definitively proved that motivational factors, the stubbornness, the bruised egos, the not invented here syndrome, the lack of financial incentives, were actually the least important barriers to transferring knowledge.
The absolute least important.
Yes. Now, I must pause here because I feel compelled to challenge this premise on behalf of traditional economic theory.
Go for it.
If you open any classic economics textbook, the fundamental tenet is that incentives drive human behavior.
Show me the incentive, and I will show you the outcome.
Exactly. If a company tells a team in London, we will double your annual bonus if you adopt this practice from New York, surely basic human greed ensures the transfer happens.
You would think so.
How can the data possibly rule out basic human incentives as the primary driver?
It's a great question, and it's exactly why this study is so disruptive.
Yeah.
Because canonical correlation analysis isolates those variables.
Right.
What the data showed was that even in cases where the incentives were perfectly aligned, where the London team desperately wanted the bonus and there was zero turf war, the transfer still routinely failed.
Fascinating.
Yeah. The data proved that you can throw all the money, all the free lunches, all the motivational threats in the world at a team, but if certain structural knowledge barriers exist, the transfer is physically impossible.
So it is not a user motivation error.
No. It is an operating system error.
A structural failure, regardless of desire. So if we completely exonerate the turf wars and the lack of bonuses, what does the data reveal as the actual culprits behind this internal stickiness?
Statistically speaking, Those political issues pale in comparison to three massive, fundamentally knowledge-related barriers.
And what is the first?
The first culprit ties right back to our first paper by Cohen and Leventhal. It's a lack of absorptive capacity in the recipient unit.
The receiving department simply lacks the foundational vocabulary to comprehend what the successful department is attempting to teach them.
Exactly. If the successful Tokyo branch is utilizing highly advanced predictive analytics to manage their supply chain, and the Chicago branch has never been trained beyond basic spreadsheet entry.
No amount of financial incentivization will magically bridge that cognitive gap.
Nope. The Chicago team literally cannot read the French poetry the Tokyo team is sending them. They lack the baseline ACAP.
That makes perfect logical sense. But the second major barrier Solansky identified is perhaps even more fascinating.
Because it implicates the successful department, right?
It does indeed. He identified causal ambiguity as a massive hurdle.
Causal ambiguity.
Yes. This occurs when the knowledge being transferred is so deeply tacit, so heavily embedded in complex daily routines, that even the source department doesn't fully understand exactly why their practice is so successful.
Oh, man. This is where the reality of the workplace gets incredibly messy.
How so?
Think about a highly successful sales team. They are just crushing their quotas every single quarter.
Right.
But their success isn't just a simple script you can email to someone else. It is a wildly complex mix of undocumented habits.
The specific charismatic talents of individuals, perhaps?
Yeah, and the way they informally bounce ideas off each other in the break room, and just the unique environmental pressure of their specific office.
They don't have a clean, step-by-step instruction manual for their success.
Exactly. They just,
Yeah.
they do it.
And herein lies the crux of causal ambiguity. If a successful team cannot clearly articulate the specific, discrete factors of production that lead to their success, they cannot possibly teach it to a struggling team.
Because the knowledge is irreducibly uncertain.
Precisely. When the struggling team tries to copy them, they might copy the superficial things.
Like holding a meeting at 9 a.m. instead of 10 a.m.
Exactly. But they miss the subtle, tacit interactions that actually drive the performance.
It's like trying to bake a cake by watching a master chef, but the chef never measures anything. They just throw ingredients in by feel.
A brilliant analogy. You cannot replicate the feel.
You really can't. And that leads directly to the third massive barrier he highlighted, an arduous relationship between the two departments.
Yes, the structural intimacy of the firm. Tacit knowledge, this unwritten feel you just described, cannot be transferred via a single memo or a PowerPoint presentation.
Definitely not.
It requires numerous, highly iterative face-to-face exchanges. It requires shadowing, correcting mistakes in real time, and deep collaboration.
Which takes a lot of trust.
Indeed. If the source and the recipient units do not have pre-existing intimacy, if their communication channels are poor or distant, the sheer friction of trying to communicate this complex tacit knowledge will cause the transfer to collapse under its own weight.
So if we synthesize what we've learned so far, to survive,
Yeah.
a company needs a foundational vocabulary to scan the outside world.
Yes.
And to share knowledge internally, they need shared capacity, a clear understanding of their own processes, and deep structural intimacy.
A very succinct summary.
But this naturally leads us to a massive multi-billion-dollar question.
Proceed.
What happens when a firm decides it urgently needs to absorb knowledge from an entirely different company? Not just reading their patents, but actively partnering with them in a strategic alliance or a joint venture.
A profoundly relevant question, particularly as joint ventures become increasingly common as a means of rapid innovation.
Right.
This brings us to 1998 and the highly influential research conducted by Peter Lane and Michael Lubatkin.
Okay, what do they look at?
They focused their lens specifically on R&D alliances between massive established pharmaceutical corporations and smaller, highly specialized biotechnology firms.
Oh, this was such an incredible era to study.
It truly was the dawn of a new model.
Yeah, in the late 90s, you had these colossal pharma companies realizing that the future was in biotech. But instead of trying to invent it all themselves, they started forming strategic alliances with these tiny, nimble biotech startups.
They were paying hundreds of millions of dollars just to be in the room.
Exactly, hoping to absorb the startup's cutting-edge knowledge.
And what Lane and Lubatkin observed was a glaring inconsistency. Some pharmaceutical giants successfully absorbed the biotech IP and integrated it beautifully.
While others failed miserably.
Failed utterly, learning absolutely nothing despite identical financial investments.
Which is wild.
It is. Up until this specific paper, the prevailing academic thought, heavily influenced by the original Cohen and Leventhal model, was that absorptive capacity was an absolute internal metric.
Like a static score.
Precisely. The assumption was, if a pharmaceutical company spends $2 billion a year on R&D, they're a good learner, full stop. They should be able to learn from anyone.
But Lane and Lubatkin looked at the alliance data and proved that this absolute metric was entirely insufficient, right?
They did. They proved that absorptive capacity in the context of an alliance is actually relative.
Relative.
It is a dyad. It is a highly specific, unique, one-to-one relationship between a student firm and a teacher firm.
To put it plainly, a massive pharmaceutical company might possess a brilliant learning capacity when partnered with biotech firm A,
Yes.
but completely and utterly fail to absorb a single usable insight when partnered with biotech firm B, even while utilizing the exact same scientists and the exact same budget.
Precisely. It is all about the alignment between the two specific entities.
That is such a critical distinction. It means you aren't just a good learner or a bad learner in a vacuum. Your ability to learn depends entirely on who is trying to teach you.
Exactly.
So what actually determines if the student and the teacher are a good match?
Lane and Lubatkin identified that the ability of one firm to effectively learn from another depends heavily on the similarity of three highly specific organizational pillars.
Okay, what's the first pillar?
The first pillar is basic knowledge similarity. This is the easiest to conceptualize. Both the student and the teacher must share a fundamental underlying scientific understanding.
So they need that shared vocabulary we discussed earlier.
Indeed. However, crucially, they must possess diverse, specialized knowledge to make the exchange actually valuable.
Right. You need enough common ground to be able to have a conversation, but you need enough differences to actually have something worth talking about.
Exactly. If you both know exactly the same specialized techniques, there is no learning to be had. It's just an echo chamber.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. What's the second pillar?
The second and third pillars are where the research becomes structurally fascinating and, frankly, where most corporate alliances fail. The second pillar is the alignment of knowledge processing systems.
Knowledge processing systems, so like how they actually work day to day.
Yes. This refers to the actual structure of the firm, the formalization of lower management, the centralization of research, the standard operating procedures.
Okay, let's bring this to life. Let's upgrade our technology analogy from earlier.
Please do.
Imagine you are trying to integrate a scrappy, agile, 50-person tech startup, and they operate in rapid 2-week development sprints.
A very modern, fast-paced environment.
Totally. They don't have formal meetings. They just shout ideas across the room and build prototypes over the weekend.
Right.
Now imagine a massive 150-year-old legacy bank acquires them.
A terrifying yet highly realistic scenario.
Exactly. The bank requires 6 months of formal compliance review, signed in triplicate by 3 different vice presidents, just to change the font on a customer website.
The cultural clash would be deafening.
It would. Even if the bank is spending $1 billion on R&D, and even if they desperately want the startup's knowledge, the knowledge simply will not flow. Because the agile, rapid-fire insights of the startup will hit the brick wall of the bank's compliance structure. Their internal operating structures, their knowledge processing systems are fundamentally incompatible.
Brilliantly explained. And that systemic incompatibility is heavily reinforced by the third and perhaps most deeply ingrained pillar, compensation practices.
Compensation. So how people get paid.
Yes. Lane and Lubatkin utilized compensation as a powerful, measurable proxy for a company's underlying culture and its dominant logic.
I love this because you can tell exactly what a company truly values by looking at who gets the biggest bonus.
Indeed, you can. Let us apply this to your startup and legacy bank scenario.
Okay.
Suppose the legacy bank evaluates and rewards its staff based on highly algorithmic, predictable, short-term task completion.
0 errors, strict compliance, hitting the quarterly decimal point perfectly.
Precisely. That is their compensation culture. The startup, conversely, rewards long-term experiential risk-taking.
Right, they give massive equity bonuses to the team that tries something wild, even if it fails, because failure is viewed as a stepping stone.
So what happens when the bank tries to learn the startup's secret sauce?
Oh, I see it. The tacit knowledge, that vital know-how embedded in the risk-taking culture, will be violently rejected by the algorithmic culture of the bank.
Exactly. The bank's employees will not adopt the startup's methods, because adopting those methods would require taking risks that actively jeopardize their algorithmic bonuses.
Because why would they risk their own paycheck?
Exactly. The structural misalignment guarantees the failure of the transfer.
Wow. So, synthesizing this for the managers listening,
Yes.
when you are evaluating a potential strategic partnership or contemplating acquiring a smaller firm strictly for their intellectual property, you are making a massive mistake if you only look at their patents or their tech stack.
You must look much deeper.
You have to perform a rigorous audit of their knowledge processing systems and their compensation culture. Because if you do that audit and realize their operating system is fundamentally incompatible with yours, your relative absorptive capacity is effectively zero.
You will spend millions of dollars, and the knowledge download will just crash. You'll get a systemic error message.
An incredibly vital warning for any mergers and acquisitions team.
Truly.
Now, we have established that structural alignment is crucial for absorbing knowledge, whether internally between departments or externally from an alliance partner.
We have.
But this naturally begs a highly operational question.
Which is?
If structure is destiny, how exactly does a manager engineer their own internal organizational machinery to optimize this absorption? Can you actually build a company that is structurally designed to learn better?
You absolutely can. But as the research shows, it requires a remarkably delicate, almost counterintuitive balancing act.
Counterintuitive.
Yes. To really understand the mechanics of this, we're going to turn to a pivotal 2005 empirical study conducted by researchers Janssen, Vanden Bosch, and Volberta.
Okay, what do they look at?
To get their data, they didn't look at startups. They conducted a massive, comprehensive survey within a large European multi-unit financial services firm.
Okay, so a massive, heavily regulated corporate environment.
Exactly. And their great contribution to this field was taking the monolithic concept of absorptive capacity and essentially splitting the atom.
Splitting the atom, I like that.
I find their approach deeply clarifying. Up until this study, many practitioners still viewed ACP as a single, homogeneous blob of organizational capability. You are either good at learning or you are not.
Right.
But these researchers divided it into two entirely distinct manageable buckets. They called them potential absorptive capacity and realized absorptive capacity.
Okay, let's break these down. Potential ACPAS. That is all about acquiring and assimilating knowledge.
Yes.
It's basically your organization's radar dish. It is how you constantly sweep the horizon, renew your knowledge stock, and pull fresh, raw information into the front.
Conversely, realized ACPAP is entirely about transforming and exploiting that knowledge.
Okay, so if potential ACCAP is the radar dish, realized ACCAP is the engine room.
A perfect analogy. It is the machinery that takes the raw data the radar has found, refines it, and turns it into actual profit.
Highly efficient new products and tangible bottom-line results.
Precisely. And the reason this split is so vital for anyone running a business is that the researchers didn't just define these buckets.
What else did they do?
They mapped specific organizational tools, what they call managerial levers, to each one.
Okay.
And the shocking part is that the levers you pull to boost one bucket do not help the other. In fact, they can actually hurt it.
Wait, really? The tools work against each other?
They do. This is where the engineering of the firm becomes highly complex. The study revealed that coordination capabilities specifically and exclusively boost potential ACAP.
Coordination capabilities, like what?
If you want a better radar dish, you must implement coordination tactics. These include creating robust cross-functional interfaces, establishing permanent interdepartmental task forces.
Getting people in a room together.
Yes. Implementing mandatory job rotation, so employees are forced to see different operational sides of the business. And encouraging broad, decentralized participation in decision-making.
Okay, so all of those actions drastically increase the sheer volume and flow of raw information sweeping into the firm.
They do.
But, and this is the crucial caveat, those specific coordination tactics don't necessarily help you exploit the knowledge to actually make a profit.
Not at all.
Having everyone in a cross-functional brainstorming meeting is great for finding new ideas, but it's terrible for executing a supply chain flawlessly.
Precisely. To boost realized ACAP, to execute and exploit, you must pull an entirely different set of levers, which the researchers termed socialization capabilities.
Socialization capabilities, so engineering connectedness.
Yes. You must foster high-density social networks within the firm where employees actually trust one another. You utilize socialization tactics to create deeply shared norms, values, and beliefs.
So everyone is on the exact same page.
Exactly. This shared homogeneous culture acts as an operational glue. It allows different departments to take a new piece of knowledge and rapidly, effectively exploit it without constantly fighting political battles over exactly how it should be implemented.
Okay, so you need coordination to find the ideas and socialization to execute them. But the researchers uncovered a massive trap here, didn't they?
They did. They uncovered what I consider one of the most profound paradoxes in modern management theory, the paradox of routinization.
The paradox of routinization.
Study closely examines systems capabilities, which encompasses the formalization of rules, the strict routinization of tasks, and the creation of rigid standard operating procedures.
Right.
What they found was that highly routinized environments are absolutely excellent for realized ACFP. If your goal is to exploit existing knowledge with maximum financial efficiency, you absolutely need rigid routines.
Right. You want the factory line to run exactly the same way every single time to maximize your margin.
Exactly. However, the data proved that that exact same routinization significantly, actively destroys your potential ACAP.
Wow. It destroys the radar dish.
Yes. The tighter you wind the firm to execute efficiently, the more rigid and blind the organization becomes. The rules and routines act as blinders, making it nearly impossible for the firm to acquire and assimilate brand new paradigm-shifting knowledge from the outside world.
I want to pause and really emphasize this to you listening because it challenges everything we are taught about operational excellence.
It does.
This data suggests you can actually be too organized to learn.
Indeed.
If you over-index on exploiting your current knowledge for maximum short-term profits if you Six Sigma your supply chain until it is flawless, if your metrics are perfectly routinized, if every employee is strictly confined to maximizing their specific KPI.
You inevitably fall into what researchers call a competence trap.
A competence trap. You become a highly optimized, incredibly efficient dinosaur right before the meteor hits.
Exactly. You are perfectly adapted to a world that is about to stop existing.
So, to survive long-term, this research says you have to build deliberate inefficiencies into your system.
Deliberate inefficiencies. A phrase that strikes fear into the heart of any operations manager.
But it's true. You have to force job rotation even if you know it will slow down productivity for a quarter while the employee gets up to speed.
Yes.
You have to create cross-functional task forces that might look like an absolute waste of time and money on a spreadsheet just to force different departments to talk to each other.
You must build these inefficiencies to keep your organization's eyes open to the outside world.
You need the radar sweeping constantly,
Yeah.
even if it uses up power and budget that could theoretically be going to the engines.
And maintaining this balance requires a state of organizational ambidexterity that is incredibly difficult to sustain.
It's a masterful juggling act.
It is. You must possess the leadership capability to keep parts of your firm loosely coordinated enough to constantly scan the chaotic environment, while simultaneously keeping other parts of your firm tightly socialized and highly routinized enough to execute and deliver quarterly earnings.
But let's be totally real for a second and play devil's advocate against the very models we've been discussing.
By all means.
This neat, clean division between assimilating information over here and transforming it over there. It sounds fantastic on a pristine whiteboard in an MBA classroom.
A very theoretical elegance.
Right. You pull the coordination lever, the knowledge comes in. You pull the socialization lever, the profit comes out. But in the actual blood and guts reality of chaotic market disruptions, does corporate learning ever actually happen in a straight, predictable line like that?
A highly astute critique. And it happens to be the precise critique leveled by researchers Gargana Todorova and Boris Dorizin in their seminal 2007 paper.
Which heavily informed the later frameworks by Volberta, right?
Exactly. Todorova and Dorizin looked at these streamlined sequential models and argued that they had become far too neat.
They stripped out the humanity.
Precisely. In their pursuit of a clean flowchart, previous researchers had stripped away the messy, cognitive, and deeply human realities of how large organizations actually behave under pressure. They sought to inject the complexity back into the model.
And to do that, they insisted on returning all the way back to the very first step of Cohen and Leventhal's original 1990 definition, didn't they?
They did. Over the intervening years, some subsequent models had watered down the very first step of absorptive capacity to mere acquisition.
Implying that a firm just vacuums up whatever data is in front of it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But Todorova and Dorizin vigorously reclaimed the original phrasing, recognizing the value.
Recognizing the value.
They pointed out a vital cognitive reality. An organization does not passively acquire everything it sees. It actively, aggressively filters information.
Oh, absolutely.
And very often, a company's obsolete architectural knowledge or its deeply ingrained cognitive frames cause it to screen out vital, existentially threatening data before it ever reaches the decision makers.
This is such a crucial psychological point. Let's look at the classic example of analog camera manufacturers.
A tragic but perfect illustration.
Right. If you have spent 40 years building a sprawling, globally dominant company that makes the best analog film cameras in the world, your entire cognitive reality is built around the chemistry of film.
Yes, your R&D labs are chemical labs.
Exactly. Your supply chain is built for physical film. Your sales team knows how to sell the aesthetic of film.
So when the very first grainy, low-resolution digital camera technology appears on the horizon,
Your company's cognitive filters don't just accidentally misunderstand it, they actively, aggressively reject it.
because it does not fit the frame.
Exactly. The executives look at the digital file and say, well, this is a low-quality toy. Real photographers will never use this. They entirely fail to recognize the value because the value doesn't fit their established worldview.
A perfect illustration of cognitive filtering, which brings us to Todorova and Derisen's most massive conceptual shift in the literature.
Which is?
In the earlier, streamlined models we discussed, transformation was viewed merely as a sequential step that happened after assimilation.
The flowchart dictated. You acquire the data, you assimilate the data into your processes, you transform it into a product, and you exploit it for profit. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3.
Exactly. But Todorova and Derisen shattered that flowchart.
How so?
They argued that assimilation and transformation are not sequential steps on the same path. They are fundamentally alternative paths.
Okay, this is perhaps the most vital distinction for a manager to grasp. Let us examine the mechanics of these two distinct paths.
Proceed.
When new external knowledge perfectly fits a firm's existing cognitive models, when it aligns seamlessly with their prior related knowledge, the firm goes down the path of assimilation.
It smoothly, relatively painlessly integrates the new data into its current understanding and processes.
Right. Sticking with our computer analogies. Assimilation is exactly like dragging a newly downloaded file into an existing, well-organized folder on your computer's desktop.
The folder is already there. It is labeled correctly.
The operating system recognizes the file type. You just drop the file in and seamlessly keep working. It requires almost zero effort.
Precisely. But what happens during a true competence-destroying market change?
What happens to our legacy analog camera makers when highly advanced digital technology rapidly takes over the market?
That new knowledge, the reality of digital sensors and microchips, does not fit their existing chemical cognitive model.
No, it doesn't. They physically cannot assimilate it.
Therefore, if the firm wishes to survive, it cannot go down the path of assimilation. It must force itself down the excruciating path of transformation.
Transformation.
The firm must completely alter its fundamental cognitive structures, overhaul its operational logic, and redefine its very understanding of the industry and itself just to be able to absorb the new reality.
And to finish the analogy, transformation isn't just dragging a new file into a folder.
No, it is not.
Transformation is the terrifying realization that the new file requires a completely new, entirely foreign operating system.
A complete overhaul.
Yes. To even open the file, you have to back up your data, reformat your entire hard drive, wipe out your comfortable old folder structure, and install an OS you barely know how to use.
It is a deeply painful, incredibly expensive, and highly disruptive process.
And because it is so painful, it causes massive systemic internal resistance.
And that very concept of internal resistance leads us to the final and perhaps most brutally realistic addition that Todorova and Dresen contributed to the model.
Okay, lay it on me.
The inescapable role of social integration and internal power relationships.
Ah, yes. The politics.
Indeed. Up until this point in the literature, researchers had largely discussed social integration, things like internal connectedness, shared norms, and socialization capabilities as universally positive attributes.
Right, things that help a firm exploit knowledge efficiently.
Exactly. But Todorova and Derisen introduced a heavy dose of realpolitik. They pointed out that social networks within a corporation are not always positive collaborative forces.
No, they are deeply, inextricably intertwined with power dynamics.
Because organizations aren't just logic machines.
No, they're deeply political beasts.
Exactly. Power dynamics dictate whose knowledge is deemed valuable and whose knowledge is conveniently ignored or actively suppressed.
Okay, if we return to the concept of a competence-destroying technology, imagine the internal landscape of a major corporation.
Okay.
Suppose a brilliant mid-level engineer in a peripheral R&D lab discovers a new technology.
A massive breakthrough.
Yes, but this new technology directly threatens the prestige, the massive operational budget, or perhaps the very existence of the senior vice president's legacy division.
Ah, the VP who built their entire 30-year career on the old technology.
Precisely. In that scenario, the dense social networks and shared norms within that company might not be used to efficiently exploit the new knowledge.
Not at all.
Those very same social networks might be weaponized by the old guard to suppress the engineer, bury the research, and protect the status quo.
The capability of a firm to transform its cognitive structures is not simply an intellectual or structural exercise. It is very often a brutal internal political battle over resources, legacy, and influence.
Wow. That paints a completely different picture of corporate failure,
It certainly does.
because it means a company could technically do everything right on paper.
Yes, they could have massive potential absorptive capacity.
Their radar could be sweeping perfectly. They could see the market disruption coming from a mile away. They could have brilliant scientists who understand the new technology flawlessly.
But if the internal power dynamics bottleneck that knowledge,
If the senior leadership uses their political capital to protect their legacy turf and refuse the painful reformatting of the hard drive, the transformation path is blocked.
and the company dies anyway, fully aware of what killed it.
It is a sobering reality.
It is. And if we connect this final piece to the broader picture of our exploration today, it definitively proves that absorptive capacity cannot be treated by executives as a purely mechanical, structural, or economic variable.
It is a deeply human, deeply cognitive, and deeply political phenomenon.
Quite so.
Okay, we have covered an absolutely incredible amount of ground today, traversing 20 years of complex theory. So let's do a comprehensive recap for everyone listening to solidify the mechanics of this machinery.
A very good idea.
We started in 1990 exploring how absorptive capacity isn't just about throwing ungodly amounts of money at an R&D budget hoping for a patent.
No. It is the absolute prerequisite for building the foundational vocabulary that allows you to recognize external threats.
Which prevents your firm from suffering irreversible technological lockout.
We then moved to the internal mechanics of the firm, discovering that building this shared vocabulary and fostering structural intimacy is the only true cure for internal stickiness.
The data definitively proved that internal knowledge transfer requires focused knowledge translation and shared capacity, rather than simply throwing financial incentives and bonuses at deeply ingrained structural barriers.
From there, we looked externally at strategic alliances, learning that ACAP is not an absolute metric, but a relative dyad.
If you want to absorb knowledge from a partner, it demands deep structural compatibility, a matching of both the technical know-how and the cultural know-why.
Especially regarding compensation and risk tolerance. We then examined the delicate internal engineering required to balance these competing demands.
We learned that a manager must carefully calibrate coordination capabilities to boost their potential to learn.
Against socialization and routinization capabilities designed to exploit that learning.
It requires the immense discipline to build deliberate inefficiencies into your organization, preventing the very real danger of becoming too highly organized to learn.
And finally, we dismantled the clean flowcharts, seeing that true disruptive learning isn't just a smooth assimilation process.
Surviving a market shift requires agonizing structural cognitive transformation. A transformation that is always inevitably subject to the messy, combative reality of human power dynamics and corporate politics.
Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought for you to consider as you return to your own operational roles, building upon that final reality of power dynamics.
I want you to critically evaluate the structure of your own department or your own team.
When a brilliant, potentially disruptive piece of external knowledge enters your firm, does its survival and subsequent implementation depend upon the objective, data-driven quality of the knowledge itself?
Or does its survival depend almost entirely on the political power and the internal social capital of the specific person holding it?
That is the million-dollar question for any manager trying to drive innovation.
If your organization's absorptive capacity is being systematically bottlenecked by internal politics, cognitive filtering, and the fierce protection of legacy status, you must recognize the danger.
Because if the internal machinery is broken, all the massive R&D spending in the world
And all the beautifully structured cross-functional teams you can muster.
will not save your firm from the next market disruption.
Thank you so much for joining us for this session of the Pocket MBA. We highly encourage you to take these insights back to the office and actively audit your own team's absorptive capacity this week.
Keep your radar sweeping.
Watch out for those deliberate inefficiencies, and we will see you next time.